Welcome to The Drop and our Succession Recap podcast. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with Thomas Mitchell and Mel Kembrey to break down episode 4 of Succession season 4. Mel, welcome to the pod. Super excited to have you on board.
Thanks for having me. I think it's a good time to join.
You are our Marsha, basically. You know, you sort of jumped on board as Marsha's returned to the show. Very exciting.
I have, and there is a Melanie mentioned in the show, Marsha briefly. I think she's in the help for Marsha, and she's mentioned quickly offhand.
You're much more than the help and an offhand guest for us. We're really keen to get your insights and thoughts on this episode and for the rest of the season. Let's get into a kind of top line discussion about this episode. I thought it was a pretty significant gear change. The last episode was this emotional gut punch, and I feel like there were takes and takes and takes for a week from that episode being released. People are still kind of coming to terms in terms of what it means, I guess, for Succession to lose Logan Roy. This is the first episode across the entire show's history to not have Brian Cox in it, and it was noticed. I think there were so many characters. There was a real absence of a center of gravity, or a kind of a sun that everything else rotated around. It was basically set in just one or two rooms, really heavy on the dialogue, and a real massive return to form for Kendall, and a really extraordinary performance from Jeremy Strong. How did you take this episode, Mel? What are your top line reactions?
Yeah, I thought they kept the intensity really high. Part of me expected that after all the enormity of the last episode that they would maybe kind of take it down a notch, kind of reset. It's that middle of the season episode, but they didn't do that at all. I thought they ratcheted it up, and as you mentioned, that we were all set in one location. It was this castle without a king. It was all set over a kind of hour leading up to that board meeting, and it just was so tense, all the power playing going on. So they really kept their foot on the accelerator, and I thought they did really well in treading a line between showing the genuine emotion that everyone is feeling about the loss of Logan, particularly the siblings, without getting kind of carried away with that grief, because grief is kind of boring to watch for too long on a show. So I thought they tread really well between the wheeling and dealing, but then also having those moments of real genuine sadness that those siblings are obviously feeling.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I was a bit worried that they would just kind of move on from the emotion we felt in episode 3, but there was a little bit of this sense of, no, we're still like in the immediate aftermath of that. We're moving on, but these kids are still feeling it. We haven't just contained all that emotion to just this one really hectic episode. How about you, Thomas? How did you feel about this one?
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of disagree. Like, for me, it was a massive come down, I thought. Like, I didn't think it had that same tension. I think it's natural. Like, it was impossible to... Obviously, like, episode 3 was the biggest episode in the show's history, probably. And for me, it was like a massive come down. Like, it felt tonally very similar to episode 1, which I think is the weakest episode of the season so far. It felt like an episode that was written with, like, the function of what that episode needed to achieve in mind. So we had to kind of, like, get into the... We had to stay in the grief, but also, like, the battle line starts to be drawn and, like, you know, we start to see the moves being made. I just didn't think... I didn't think it was a great episode. It was not that funny. It was like everything that needed to happen did. But yeah, I think it was a natural kind of like slow burn from what was, you know, obviously a very intense like explosion in episode 3.
Yeah, it's. I feel like you're a kind of a guy. You love the big set pieces and watching that unfold. I feel like this, comparing it to episode 1, I think is pretty smart because it felt like a reset. Episode 1 was putting all those pieces on the board, reminding us where things were at the end of season 3. And this one again is like, okay, we need a whole episode to sort of readjust to life post Logan Roy before we can really get into it. And I feel like this episode hinted at a lot more to come, but it was still a pretty dense episode. I was thinking about how we should tackle it, the three of us, as we talk about it. And there was really just like one main plot point. It was this discussion of like what should happen next. And there were a lot of characters that featured, that all had dialogue and a lot of really curious interactions. People that we normally don't see talking to one another were talking to one another.
Some of those people, never seen them before. Like Penelope, is she like who is Penelope? Who is Melanie? Which is obviously something you ask yourself every day.
She's a central character. Please.
No, but like because especially that scene where Kendall's walking in, he's got the glasses on, he's like so deep in his like Kendallism, and then everyone's like doing the like offering their condolences and stuff. But I was like. Strangers, all of them strangers.
And I think it's that thing that there's all of a sudden this vacuum and people come out of the woodwork trying to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
I wonder whether they just, like Jesse Armstrong had a bunch of leftover budget for this season and he's like, all these extras who never get lines, you can have a line. We'll give you $50K for this.
Yeah, we'll save some money on Con's wedding, so let's put it into this.
Yeah, now that Brian Cox isn't getting paid anymore.
So the episode opens with us kind of getting a quick sense of where each of the siblings are at. They're kind of still dealing with the emotional fallout of their father's death. But very quickly, we get a pretty big reveal, which is that Shiv is pregnant. She speaks to her doctor who confirms and sort of sets her up for a 20-week scan. We're going to delve into what that might mean for her character in the show a bit later on in this conversation. But very quickly, we move from that setup of how they're feeling to Logan's house, sans Logan. It's where everyone seems to be gathering. It's not quite a funeral or a wake. It just seems to be, let's get everyone together and figure out what happens next. Marsha is there. She's made a triumphant return, claiming that she's been speaking to Logan day and night for the last few weeks. There's a board meeting scheduled, we find out pretty quickly, for later that day to decide on the interim CEO of Waystar Royco, and that obviously elicits this scramble to decide who that interim CEO will be. We see the kind of corporate execs, Tom refers to them as the greybeards, deciding amongst themselves who it should be. The siblings are quite keen to retain that control for themselves, and these two factions end up colliding thanks to the discovery of this piece of paper that seems to be Logan's wishes. It's not quite clear when it was written. It's not quite clear whether or not he intended what people are interpreting to happen. The most important thing is that Kendall's name is on a piece of paper that suggests that Logan may have wanted him to be CEO at some point. But then there's a pencil mark, which is either an underline or a crossing out. And I think this is where elements of this show reminded me of the earlier seasons, which were much more a satire on what corporate media world would be. This sort of such a silly, almost slapstick moment of like, does this thing mean that Kendall is really in or it means he's really out? But basically that piece of paper sets off the sequence of events that sees Kendall and Roman teaming up, getting the support they need to become the interim leaders of the company. And then the very final sequence is this discussion as to whether or not Kendall and Roman should be, I guess, leaking against their dad or creating an impression that their dad was losing the plot and they were really the ones running the company all along. Roman's not quite into that idea. He doesn't want to shit on his dad's reputation when he's barely been dead for, more than 24 or 48 hours. Kendall makes a secret deal with Hugo to claim that his dad was losing the plot, and we basically see Kendall become his dad in that moment. So quite a significant episode for Kendall's transformation. He's back in the game and he's playing it harder than he ever has. The thing that stuck out to me, guys, about this episode was just how keenly Logan's absence was felt. That the first half of the episode, at least, everyone is spinning around like a top. No one really knows what to do. They're not quite sure who should be taking the lead and coordinating things. They don't have any consensus within each faction, within themselves, who should be leading the company, essentially. And I think the best way to discuss where things go from here, I think, is to look at each of those different factions. So we can look at the kind of the siblings and that kind of greybeard corporate exec level first. Let's talk about those guys. So we have Frank and Carl. They're kind of teaming up. Carolina and Jerry, they seem to be having a sort of girl power alliance. I don't know if that's flippant to say, but that just seemed to be the only real connection those two have. I'm not quite clear that they really get along or have a relationship beyond that connection. Tom makes a bit of a play, but he's rebuffed pretty quickly. We'll have a lot more to say about Tom later on as well. Thomas, like, I find that corporate level drama, more funny than like particularly exciting or revealing. We spent a lot of time with those guys this time around. How did you feel about, when that scene when they go into that kitchenette and they're all sort of debating amongst themselves who should take this throne?
Yeah, it was interesting because it felt like, typically in Succession you have, or especially lately, you have the kids as like one set of sequence of events, and then it bounces back to like the other greybeards, but normally led by Logan. Whereas, like, as you said, obviously he was like missing now. And so it did feel kind of weird. I was surprised at how quickly Carl seemed to step up. Like, Carl was just like, bang, killer straight away. And like particularly in that scene when they're in the kitchenette, kind of having a meeting. And I think it's Tom who kind of puts his case forward for why perhaps he should be in the conversation. And Carl gives him this speech where basically talks him through the optics of why that would be a bad idea. And it is like so scathing. So it's interesting to see like how quickly Carl stepped into that vacuum. I agree. It did feel funny. Like there was a noticeable absence. I just don't really... I'm not convinced on the greybeards as like a power force. I think they're a foil for now. We need to have, like something for the kids to play against, but I don't see them as a significant threat.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It does feel like we're spending time with them partly because it's funny, partly because these characters get great lines, but also they're kind of like this, like a red herring. It's like they just exist to be a counterbalance to the siblings. Does that feel right to you, Mel, or do you think there's something more interesting happening with those guys?
I will say we were talking about how much dialogue there was in this episode, and I absolutely loved that corporate level dialogue that was going on. I thought it was so well written, and there seemed to be this consistent sense of like synonyms that just grew as it happened, and particularly about like the piece of paper. Like I loved that it was the paper situation, and then someone called it a doodle, and then it was a musings, and then it was like a jerking over a piece of paper he scribbled your name on. Like I really enjoyed this.
They kept like reducing it. Yeah.
Yeah, this interplay and the words. What do they mean? And everyone's just power playing with the language the whole time, and I really enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mel. That dialogue, it reminded me of, this show that Jesse Armstrong's worked on before, The Thick of It, which is one of the best political satires of all time, which is essentially like this episode across a few seasons. It's just a bunch of very smart, funny people in rooms making fun of each other and using more and more absurd metaphors to basically take each other down. Beyond the kind of the humor of it, we do see like Carl and Frank and Jerry all kind of make their own pitches. Do you think that is something that the show is going to delve deeper into, or do you think that this is just kind of us ticking off the boxes to get to a point of, well, they're probably no one here has the support amongst their own colleagues, so what chance do they have of actually getting enough support to lead the entire company?
I think the show is going to delve further into it, and it's an extremely cynical and dark take, because I love that during this whole time, it's so clear that they all just want to get the best outcome for themselves. And there's no talk about, like, we know Logan from what they've spoken about him before. He was kind of right-winged. He was into the tabloids. He was anti-environment. Like, there's no talk of, like, the potential shift vision-wise this company could take. It's all about what they can get out of it. And I think one character mentions, they've bought half a Greek island. Another character, Hugo, is telling Kendall his daughter might be done for insider trading because he gave her the hot tip that Logan had died. So I think they're all like, it almost is like that wholesale, they go into the China room, but it's almost like they're grabbing as much China as they can while they can so they can all get out. Like I think it will play out, but I don't know how invested they are in the longevity of the company. I think they all want the best thing for themselves, and then they're all out.
But see, I kind of disagree, because like the thing that like kind of hovers over all of this, and I think Kendall says it a couple times, it's like theoretically this big conversation, it's like all this power play is for like interim CEO. Because like essentially the Gojo deal is supposed to go through, and then it doesn't really matter for anyone, like, because then, it'll all be down to Madsen and like it's all good. But like that's why I reckon all of this like kind of like politicking about who's going to take over is the biggest clue that like Gojo deal is 100% falling over. Like even Kendall, I think when he's trying to convince maybe his siblings, he's like, oh no, maybe he's talking to Carl, and he's like, look, no, I just want to get this done, get the deal done, and get out. I've got fresh ideas. But it's like that's such bullshit. Like this is like what he's wanted his whole life from like the first frame of the first episode. So like I think whoever it ends up being, whether it's Greybeards or the siblings, it's so clear that the interim thing is like this Gojo deal, I reckon, is falling over.
I think I've said this already once or twice, but I think it's worth returning to. I think everything we're talking about speaks to the absence of Logan. Like this company is nothing without him. Like your point, Mel, I think is so spot on that Logan created this company from nothing. He gave it vision. He gave it purpose. For all of his faults, and there are many of them, he had a ideological agenda and he created a corporate entity to execute it. No one else around him mirrors that at all. What is Waystar Royco without Logan Roy? Like it's nothing. It's a company with a name, with some assets, and a potential deal from which people might make a bit of cash. There is no one at any level of this show left who really wants to do with it what Logan did, it seems to me.
And I also think that's on a professional level, yes, and also on a personal level. Like there was that quite melancholy opening series of shots where you see the three siblings each sad, and they're having, as well as the business having its own kind of reinvention, these siblings are struggling to find a self-identity that isn't linked to their father. Like, who are they now that this paternal link has been cut? And you get that kind of, there is this sense, I think, through it of this ennui of, well, who are redefining themselves without Logan, and can they redefine themselves? And I think they slip into these old patterns of behaviour because what else are they? Like, if they're not doing this and they're not playing their dad's game, what game do they play?
I think that's really, really interesting and a really smart observation.
That is so smart. It's the smartest thing that's been said on this podcast so far, I reckon.
You reckon you guys will have me back?
I don't even know what ennui is, but it felt right in that context.
It did.
Yeah, I'm bringing French philosophy to the drop.
Let's use that as an opportunity to talk about the siblings, because I do think that this was a really significant episode for Kendall and Jeremy Strong, who plays him. I feel like the first three episodes, Kendall's taken a bit of a backseat. He started to take control towards the end of episode 3 when he sort of takes the reins after Logan passes away and tells his siblings, how they should handle this situation. But the first couple of episodes, he was just chilling. He was happy to sort of, be led by what Shiv and Roman were doing. But in this episode, he's the first face we see. He's the last face we see. We see him go from being quite grief-stricken to taking the reins, seeing the opportunity, playing the game, getting the support of all the different board members to emerge as the leader here. I kind of wasn't expecting that. I don't know whether I missed some things in the earlier episodes of this season. Like I said, I think it's just towards the end of episode 3 where you start to see hints that he's ready to get back into it. But there is this sense of, well, he's doing so great because he's not playing this game. He's liberated almost from what's driven him. What do you think, Thomas? Should we have seen this coming?
I suppose, with the benefit of hindsight, yeah, we probably should have seen it coming. I think it's even Carl says to Kendall when he starts to make the move to go back in, like, are you sure you want this? Like, you're doing so good. But, I mean, ultimately, this show has been about a set of siblings who are so kind of have been so manipulated by their father their entire lives. And I thought it was so interesting that, we've seen one Kendall all the way, first 3 episodes, we've seen this new version of Kendall. Even at the start of this episode, he looked sad and stuff, but he still seemed to be the same. And then the minute that document came out and the minute it was your name's on it, it was you could, we all know Jeremy Strong's a crazy good actor, but you could see his face change. It was all of that other stuff was gone. It was just washed away, and he was suddenly back into season 1 Kendall, where it was this is my destiny. It was supposed to be me, and even the way he starts to interact with the siblings is different. I think they've all been kind of looking after each other, and it's all been very gently, which is unusual for them. And then I think Shiv is the first one to be very kind of on guard about whether or not this document is underlined or is it crossed out or whatever. And he turns to her and says well, it sure as shit doesn't say Shiv. And that was another moment where I'm wow, Kendall has finally got his sniff of destiny, and he's switched.
Yeah, can I just say I'm not a medical professional, but from what I've read about Brene Brown, I don't think Kendall is ready for this. Like I mean, he's got an addictive personality. He killed a person. He's been unhinged, and I love that his take on the grief, like dealing with grief, was like, I had a phone call with my therapist, and it was like,
my grief guy. I've got a great grief
I've got
guy.
the best grief guy.
Such a rich person's way to solve a problem.
Yeah, and I think Kendall's switch that you're talking about is this like really dangerous trait in Kendall that, you know, Icarus, he's going to fly too close to the sun, as every time he does, and it's all going to end in disaster. So I think Kendall just needs to work on Kendall for a bit before he dives headfirst into, you know, ruining his family again.
I think you're both kind of right to an extent, because I think that piece of paper, it is worth talking about. So I think it's so funny that the way this plays out is we see Carolina get a phone call. We then see Carolina get Frank. We then see Frank get Hugo. Then Jerry walks in. No one wants to take control and make a call on what to do with this piece of paper that isn't quite a will. It doesn't have legal standing, but it's obviously quite significant. And I think they joke about wanting to throw it out the window or flush it in the toilet. I think they all just freak out. I think it speaks to their complete inability to make decisions, because they've never really been empowered by Logan to do that. They can give advice and they can facilitate and administrate, but they can't make the call. And they all freak out. They get all the kids in, and something changes with Kendall there. And I think I agree with you, Mel. I think it's a regression. I think he sees his name and he goes back to thinking, wow, maybe my daddy did think I was great. And he even says that to Frank. He's like, this proves he loves me, right? Like, he thought I could do it. And Frank's like, well, you did know that. You did know that. There was a time where you were being groomed. And then Roman reminds him, you tried to send him to jail 12 times. Like a lot has happened since the 4 years ago when your dad said, I think you should run this company. But none of that, all of that's disappeared. And Kendall is back in, my dad loved me. He thought I was the right person to lead this company. I'm the right guy to do it. And he can kick into gear, and he does kick into gear. But whether or not that is sustainable or healthy for him, I think is a very different question.
But one thing I was really curious about, and we do sometimes get this in Succession, is like scenes that possibly take place that we don't see. So, like, you know, when the Greybeards are, you know, like you said, there's that kind of chain of like events where they all get the document and discuss it. Like, when I was watching it, I was like, it feels like there is a scene there that we don't see where the Greybeards are like, let's definitely give this to the kids because they will just tear themselves apart. Like, that will take care of the kids' problem for us. And then we can just figure it out in our own team, because we know the minute we say, like, oh yeah, there's a piece of paper here that says possibly Kendall, like, especially because it's Kendall, then that will just be like total infighting, and then that like opposition is gone.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation as well. It's like those guys are not they don't hold the cards, but they are not idiots. And I think you're right. That it's an opportunity to, from their perspective, to try and fracture that group, which ultimately doesn't quite work. But Mel, I'm keen to get your read on how the other siblings reacted to this, particularly Shiv, because I feel like while Kendall, I think, like I said, I agree that I don't think this new version of him where he's just super high functioning and a bit ruthless is going to work out in the long term. It does work out for him in this episode. While I think Shiv, it's almost the opposite. I feel like she is so adrift in this episode. She can't really focus on the matters at hand. Kendall keeps trying to talk to her and get her buy-in on these decisions. She's either distracted by the significant life change going on, or she's still kind of processing what the Tom divorce is doing. But even when Kendall comes back from having basically gotten the support of Stewie and Sandy for his elevation, he says, hey, can we talk? And she just wants to talk about the fact that Connor has bought Logan's house. Like what do you make of her in this episode and her inability to kind of get on the ball?
Yeah, and there's that fall, I think, is a particularly interesting moment. Like, she has always been this figure of control and elegance and non-emotion and non-feeling, and then she has this fall in the middle of the lounge room and people try to help and pick her up, and she kind of picks herself up and pushes everyone away. And I think that's really significant and marks a transition in her character, which I think they're suggesting is based on the bombshell that we get in the first kind of 30 seconds of the episode. Do you want to chat about that?
Yeah, let's talk about it, because I'm really interested to get both your perspectives on we know that Sarah Snook, who plays Siobhan, is pregnant. She was
Yeah.
pregnant during the filming of this. And there was part of me that wondered, well, is this just their way to write in something that is going to be too hard to avoid?
Yeah, I thought
And what does that mean for the show?
I thought that too. I don't love this storyline. Like when it happened in the first like few scenes, I was a bit like, ah. And then I did think, oh, is it just like them kind of having to like work around real life because she was going to look pregnant and it became like too much of an issue. Yeah, it's a strange one. Like, turns out after all that, Tom was the one eating the walnuts or whatever it was from last season. He's the one with the...
The macaroon, man. Come
yeah,
on.
the macaroon. Presuming Tom is the father, I don't know. Like, is there a question about whether or not...
That's what we need to do the math, like, because how it's at least eight weeks.
Yeah,
if
but
they're
then the
getting
doctor
that
mentions,
test.
like, booking in the 20-week scan. I mean, let's
Yeah.
presume Tom is the father.
Well, maybe he won't be, and that will be a whole nother kind of
Yeah, possibly.
dilemma. But can I just say, I was like shocked by how fast that bombshell happened. Like, I was barely, I was still adjusting my volume. I was still getting cozy on the
Settling
couch.
into the show.
Yeah, and like I'd barely turned it on, and then it was like, wham, here we go. And
Yeah, no, I agree. It happened so quickly. I was watching with Ruby, a brilliant producer, and they're having the chat. I'm like, this feels like a chat about her being pregnant. Is that what's happening? This is happening very, very quickly, and I didn't expect it. And I'm kind of with Thomas. I sort of feel like, look, you've got to deal with reality, and so good on the writers for incorporating that. And I feel like in a different era in television, women were told to fuck off basically once they reach a certain point of their life, and that's great. But also, it just doesn't feel like this was part of the story where it was going. I don't think Jesse Armstrong was like, I think it'd be great to explore in the last 6 episodes how Shiv becoming pregnant would change things. It feels a bit much. But do you think that they are weaving it in, Mel? You seem to be suggesting that they're sort of finding a way to have that feature into her slow unraveling in this episode.
I'm really interested to see what they do with Shiv, because the kind of power she has and she displays is that kind of real like second wave 70s 80s feminism. She kind of adopts the kind of classic and in quotation kind of masculine tropes in the workplace. She's aggressive, she's unfeeling, she's unapologetic, she wears these kind of very suited looks as opposed to the different types of feminine power we see in the show. So I am interested in how they're going to make maternity change her and how they're going to make it change how other people treat her and how they navigate the reality of that situation. I think it's a tricky one. So
She's going to become like a full-time mummy blogger.
yeah, I know.
It's gonna be like a really unexpected
like
plot turn.
I think I would be so disappointed if Shiv all of a sudden became like kind.
But then I wonder, like, because that was a really weird and like kind of sad scene with her and Tom on the stairs, where they have that chat, and he's like it's actually pretty heartbreaking. He's like talking about when they first met, and it was in Paris, and like you were wearing this dress, and I stroked your arm, and
Silk. It was
yeah,
silk.
like a silk dress, and she's kind of like just gives him nothing. And then I think they talk about, Logan's not going to be able to like look after his grandkids or whatever. And then she says to him, well, that's shot now anyway. And it's like, I wonder, are they?
Which is clearly a reference to her potential kid, right?
Yeah, and then you have the fall, and so then I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe is she gonna like lose the baby? And it was like this weird glimpse into like a kind of sliding doors moment. Are we supposed to believe that like between her saying that and then the fall, that perhaps this was just like a fleeting thing? I don't know. It was definitely one of the more unexpected.
But then I also wonder, maybe it steps the tension up, because we know that Kendall has 2 kids who like we haven't seen or heard
they're
of
obviously
for a
at boarding
bit.
school,
Like
yeah.
I hope, hopefully they're getting great education somewhere. They were in that nice apartment. I really like that.
I think they're in therapy for the rest of their lives after watching their dad nearly drown himself in a pool in
Yeah.
Italy.
I mean,
I heard
they were
he's
gonna
got a
be in
good
therapy
therapist.
anyway.
Yeah.
He's got a good grief guy, good therapist.
Well, yeah, now I'm kind of, and now if Siobhan has a child, maybe the stakes change, because it's not only their future they're shoring up, there's their own personal legacy that they're trying to shore up. And I mean, Connor and Willa, maybe that's a part, I wonder if this it's the next generation of successors too that will kind of start to play in the background of this.
Yeah, the last thing I think I want to say about Shiv's pregnancy, or what she might be thinking about, is I think it's interesting that we've heard her talk about her own mother a few times in this season so far, including in the last episode. She says, "Oh, I kind of wished it was Mum who had died instead of Logan," and that's a reminder that she has an extremely toxic relationship with her own mother, and that's her only figure, her only role model for what a mum looks like. And I think she probably is also thinking about, fucking hell, like I've seen the kinds of kids my parents create. Do I want to be my mum? Am I going to be my mum? And I wonder whether that will be something that she has to grapple with a bit more explicitly. I think the show is too smart to have her talk explicitly about being raised by her mum and then throw in the fact that she's potentially about to become a mum and not have that mean something as the show progresses. Before we sort of finish our deep dive on this ep, I want to talk about the final bit of tension, right? Which is this moment where after they've been coronated, Roman and Kendall have this meeting with Hugo and Carolina, who are sort of leading the PR blitz on this, and they present them two options. They say, either we can praise your dad, we can say he's great, and you guys are stepping up to basically fill in his shoes, or, because to be honest, people think you guys suck at your jobs, we can salt the earth. We can say that Logan did a terrible job and he was incompetent, and it's really you guys who are pulling the strings the whole time. Roman is not into that. Kendall seems like he's not into it, but at the end of the episode, he basically blackmails Hugo using that bit of intel that you mentioned earlier, Mel, about the fact that Hugo leaked the death of Logan to his daughter Juliet, who did some insider trading. And he says, Hugo, you're going to tell everyone that my dad was useless, and you're going to tell everyone I was pulling the strings, because that's what dad would do. And I think, like, he's right. I think that's exactly right, and I think it is strategically the right call. But does it, at the same time, suggest that perhaps Kendall's ascended the throne, but in doing so, he's become possibly the worst version of himself that we've seen so far?
Yeah, I think so. But that's kind of like what you have to do if you want to be the CEO of this like terrifying media conglomerate, isn't it? And I think, like, you know, we have seen Kendall learn his lesson like that before. Like, again, going back to the very first episode, it's like, I think we've mentioned it on the pod before, he's meant to be closing that Volta deal, and instead he goes to Logan's 80th birthday, and Logan's like unimpressed that he goes to the birthday instead of going to close the deal. So like Kendall has had a lifetime of like head noise about not being, you know, enough of a killer, enough of, you know, the one who has the drive to do it. So now he's like, yeah, maybe in the first instance, or when Roman's there, he's like, oh yeah, no, we should definitely not do that. Like, dad's body's still warm. Let's not like shit can his reputation. And then straight away he's like, nah, this is exactly what Logan would do. We're going to bury him in the press, say he was incompetent. And yeah, I think it's completely right. It's the right move. And it's what Logan would do. It's more about like, will Roman have the capacity to be like, oh yeah, you're right, Kendall, because like as if that's a conversation that ever happens between them.
Yeah. I think this is classic impulsive Kendall.
Why do you hate Kendall so much?
This is how you end up on ice killing someone after a party. Now, I think that Kendall is so self-deluded. I think he thinks the means justifies the end. And I actually think for him, the end, and we've seen it all through, he thinks he's kind of like a cool dude. He raps. He like is in with the startups. He like has these pretensions that he's going to be good for the world and that he matters in the world. So I think ultimately Kendall still wants to go in that direction. I reckon Kendall's at heart, he thinks he's the 100 guy, and that's what he wants to do. And he says, in the end, to get these positive goals that I think are positive for the world, I'm going to do these other things.
These terrible, terrible things.
To get there and to make my mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the ultimate irony is that what they're leaking, this idea that Kendall was pulling the strings all along, is so not true. Like we've discussed this entire season, that every idea the kids have had is terrible. Like Logan had smart ideas. He was doing the right thing. These deals are the right thing. And so Kendall can take credit for it, but when he has to actually make those calls, I think it'll be exposed pretty quickly how hollow he is.
And can I just say that scene with the PRs talking to Roman and Kendall, Carolina, and Hugo, it was one of my favourite scenes of the episode. The kind of illusion of choice as they slowly, gently put out these ideas. I just loved it.
I think the acting, what makes this show elevated is not just that the main cast are so good at their jobs, but someone like Hugo and Carolina who pop in every couple of episodes and just have one or two key scenes. They go so hard. They absolutely kill it. And it's so rare for a show to have a cast of that caliber at every single level.
Yeah.
Let's Let's talk about our favorite lines from this episode. There was one that stood out to me. Mel, you picked it. I'm going to let you, because it's your first episode on this pod, walk us through your favorite line.
Oh, that's very, very generous of you.
I'm a very generous guy, famously.
Yeah, you know Kendall. So this was Jerry to Tom. Jerry says, "You're sick with grief. You might want to put down that fish taco. You're getting your melancholy everywhere." And I just loved it because I thought it summed up the entire episode so well. Everyone was self-consciously performing this grief to each other, and then while they're trying to get the best deals from themselves.
Yeah, there was a big competition of like who's the saddest about Logan, when like no one's really sad except the kids maybe.
And like even on like a sentence level, so many of the sentences were like broken into two parts, where the first was a show of grief and the second was what they wanted. Like, I think Greg said something like, "I'm so sad. You know, there's a board meeting in an hour." And there was so much of that going on, like where these sentences are split. And yeah, that kind of summed it up to me, the whole sentiment.
Yeah, it was my standard as well, particularly because you get to see Tom eat the fish taco like midway through that whole interaction, which is hilarious. My runner-up was, we see this at the start. We don't really know what the context is. When we find it out, it's so funny. When Kendall is walking into Logan's apartment, we just see Hugo on the phone saying, you're fucking me, you're wearing a strap-on and you're fucking me in the ass, which is sort of funny. We don't really know, but then we find out he's talking to his daughter, and he's saying that to his daughter after she's got him in strife for selling off Waystar stock. It's so funny. Thomas, what have you got?
Yeah, I thought it was an episode where there are not where there weren't super obvious like funny lines to me. So like shout out to the team at No Context Succession for having to pull out some.
This week's going to be a tricky one.
Yeah.
Wow, you hated this episode.
No, I didn't. I just didn't think it was Succession at its best. But that being said, I thought it was very funny when the kids were sitting together and someone brings in a stack of papers and is like, "Oh, the obits are in," and you know, Shiv makes a joke, "Oh, it's 5-star reviews." And I mean, I think we spoke about this kind of last week. The obit is a funny thing that happens in the world, and when someone like a Logan Roy dies, you have to you can't just say this person was possibly terrible. So there's a lot of spin involved, and I love that the way the kids like read the obit and then interpret the spin. So I think Shiv says he was a man of his own era. She's like reading the obit, and then Kendall says racist, also relaxed about sexual assault. I just thought that was amazing, the way those beats played off each other, because like, you know, they know exactly what their dad was, and they're having to then like read this weird like public profile of him that is so far from the man that they knew and like were raised by. And I think even at one point Shiv says, "Oh, Dad sounds like a lovely guy. I'd love to meet this dad." So I just thought that was very funny.
It came. I feel like it reminded me of, you know, when Cardinal George Pell died, and different sections of the media sort of covered his death and had different kinds of obituaries, and many of them neglected, you know, the most serious allegations against him. And so there's this desire to overlook the bad stuff, because people say in death you should just say good things. But if this is in fact the last thing you say about someone, it should be a pretty honest, warts and all take on them.
I'm interested, what do you guys think about, because it was all so insular this episode, what do you think about excluding the outside world to such an extent? Because obviously if a figure like Logan died in the real world, it would be like kind of quite earth-shattering.
Yeah.
What do you think about how they kind of just ignored that?
I thought we got just enough of an indication of that. In you know, I think Marsha's talking about prime ministers and presidents as sending their regards, and you know, Jared Mencken, who we keep talking about, who I think is coming back in the season very soon, who's that far right presidential candidate. You get a sense of the stakes of it, but I feel like this is a show that the whole point is you're seeing earth-shattering events, which the death of Logan Roy is, entirely from this perspective of the most self-interested people around him. Like, that's ultimately what this is. But I think they did just enough to remind us that this is going to have real-world consequences as well.
Yeah, it is interesting though. I'd love to see, like, if they had cut to, you know, like obviously ATN is essentially like a kind of parallel for like Fox. It would have been great if we'd saw like a CNN response to Logan Roy's death or something, or just to see, you know, what the current like temperature on Logan is, or how that would have, you know, or how that would have been received. That would have been interesting. But yeah, Succession often doesn't allow too much outside noise in because we're so in.
Let's do our favorite segment, Fun Fact Corner. We've got two this time. The first one is so interesting. There was the most recent edition of Vanity Fair. The cover story is a deep dive on Rupert Murdoch, his family, what he's been up to for the last few years, written by Gabrielle Sherman. Could not recommend reading this entire piece from start to finish more. It is a fantastic read, and the amount of parallels to Succession are so fascinating. But there are actually two very specific things I wanted to mention from this piece that relate to the creation of this show. So the first is that we get this little tidbit that Lachlan Murdoch, Rupert's sort of preferred son, who is in line to inherit the empire, thinks that James Murdoch, the son that's on the outer, is leaking real-life family plot lines to the writers of Succession as they make this show, which is incredible life imitating art, imitating life, imitating art. But I think far and away the best one is when Rupert Murdoch divorced Jerry Hall a few years ago. Apparently in her divorce agreement is a clause that says she is prohibited from speaking to the writers of Succession. Thomas, do you think she's prohibited specifically from like Jesse Armstrong, or is it a more general clause? It seems like the fact that Murdoch is so worried about this show is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I just love to think of Rupert Murdoch like sitting up at night, Logan style, watching Succession, just like absolutely fuming, firing off emails to people. Also in that article, which like I totally agree, it's a must read if you have any like even curiosity about Succession. He divorced her via email. So he sent her an email and was like, just letting you know that the dissolution of this marriage and like my New York lawyers will contact you, according to the Vanity Fair article, of course. Yes, so it is very interesting. And yeah, obviously Succession has got, they're like living rent free in Rupert's head. So...
No, I'm starting to now think about the intimate phone calls that Marsha hints that she kept having with Logan.
Yeah, exactly. Rupert's got game. We know that. He took Jerry Hall to Hamilton on their first date. So, you know, the guy knows what's up.
Speaking of phone calls, Thomas, you've got another fun fact. It's one of my favorite. One of Thomas's absolutely insane fun facts.
Yes.
But lay it on us.
Yeah, it's good to be back on Fun Fact Corner. So this is a bit of a theory that's doing rounds on the internet. Essentially, it boils down to this. So going back to episode 3.
Oh, is this serial? Am I?
Yeah, that's right.
New podcast.
And I'm Sarah Koenig. No, so going back to episode 3, essentially, a few years ago, Rian Johnson, who we all know from the Glass Onion films, he told Vanity Fair in an interview, like, when you make a film and a character is bad or doing something bad, Apple will not give you permission for them to use an iPhone. And he just mentioned it in passing as a strange kind of like insider bit of information about Hollywood. Back in 2021, TikTokers noticed that of all the characters on the show, only Kendall, Shiv, Greg, and Connor had iPhones, while Logan, Jerry, Tom, and Roman did not, because they were kind of bad characters. Now, in episode 3, we learnt that Roman had an iPhone, and so did Kendall, Greg, Shiv. They were all using iPhones. However, Tom, who took the call on the plane, was using an Android. Now, the theory is that Android users have not been given permission by Apple to use the phone because they're bad or they're going to reflect poorly on the brand. So the theory goes that Tom is going to be the one to break bad because he's using an Android in this season. The only other person we know that's using an Android in this season so far, Jerry. So the theory is that Tom and Jerry, with their stupid Android phones, are going to break bad and take over this season. And this is coming from like the deepest, darkest corners of the internet, so you know it's trustworthy.
I can't believe I'm paying you to spend your days reading these insane theories.
Mate, I reckon this one's going to come true. I've also got a few more location-based fun facts, if you like. But look, I reckon...
This whole episode was in one location.
It's one to watch. There could be something in it. The Apple, brand theory. Let's watch this space.
Do you think maybe Tom and Jerry are orchestrating a deal with Google within the show?
That would be very meta, yes.
That's why they're getting cut price Android phones.
But there was also,
it could just be, they both work at ATN, right? The company. Maybe there's an overall deal there for them to get the Android phones, whereas the others have to buy their own phone. And they're like, well, if I've got to buy my own phone, I might as well get an iPhone.
No, but Greg also works at ATN. He has an iPhone. The one last thing I want to say about this phone fun fact corner is that there was lots of people asking, why did Tom just not FaceTime them on the plane so they could at least see Logan? And it's because he's got a fucking Android. I've cracked it. I've solved Succession. Anyway, thanks for having me.
That was all worth it for that. Thank you. That's a great reveal.
I'm going to have to sit with all of this for a while.
Let's get back to the NUI.
thinking like maybe Jerry's quite organized, so maybe she like just likes syncing her Google Suite.
Also, Jerry's got that big font on the phone. She's like, she's doing the big zoom in. Anyway, moving on
with a mere one finger. Let's go on to Jerry Watch. I think Jerry's role in this episode was a real reminder that like competence doesn't really count for anything in this world. She's been nothing but a pretty effective CEO. They reminded us a few times the fact she navigated the Department of Justice investigation into the heinous crimes committed by this company, and she managed to sort of pull all of that off. She managed to survive literally being fired last episode by Roman, who was instructed by his dad. But ultimately, she likened support in this hilarious kitchenette scene where everyone's trying to count the numbers. She's just got Carolina, who's their PR person. She doesn't have a broad base of people willing to vouch for her. Anything you guys want to say about Jerry from this episode?
I feel like she's the cat with 9 lives, isn't she? She just somehow manages to hang on.
That's a good way of putting it.
And I really enjoyed that they kind of hinted that, you were actually fired last episode, and I loved the quip where she was like, I don't think there's anything on paper to that effect. So the exact opposite of what's going on with Kendall is also saving her role.
Yeah, it's a funny one. Like, I thought Jerry, ironically, has probably had the most to do in this episode, but we got the least from her. Like, she said, I shepherd in cultural change, but I didn't think she was a force to be reckoned with. And it kind of speaks to, I guess, really a lack of cultural change at Waystar, that like she just gets so kind of like bulldozed by the Frank and Kyle show. She's like only really got Carolina in her corner, even though she's like the CEO. She doesn't really seem to be like a serious player in the chat, which is like pretty damning indictment on the culture of Waystar. Like, as soon as Logan goes, like, the big boys step in and we're just like, is it going to be you or is it going to be me, or is it maybe going to be one of these like
yeah, well, great point, Tom. Is Waystar not a great corporate culture, particularly when it comes to women?
No, yeah, I know.
She seemed
and it's this insight that I'm here for. I think this and like phone gear.
She seemed kind of tired in this episode. I agree with you. Like, she just seemed to be exhausted. Jerry Light, like, just didn't have the same muster that she has had in previous seasons.
No, I agree. I'm not sure what the future holds for Jerry.
All right, time for our weekly winners and losers. Who are you giving your points to, Mel? First time, a lot of pressure.
I know, but I've been waiting for this moment because I feel like you guys are absolutely insane that you don't have Willa on your list. And Willa gets 3 points from me. I think Willa's transformation from the start of this show to now is sensational. We met her in this season. She had this kind of structured outfit on. Her hair was blonde and lightly curled, and she was the exact opposite of what Greg's kind of date was with the ugly handbag, and that was what she used to be when the show started. And look at Willa now, and there's this great moment when she meets Marsha, and Marsha says something like, "You've done well for yourself," and Willa says, "So have you." And then Willa ends the episode with a property worth $63 million, and that's a good deal. And also her mum's there checking out the awnings. So 3 points for Willa.
With a huge plate full of buffet food. Great stuff for the Willa family.
Willa family, 3 points. I'm giving Roman 2 points only because I think we've made it clear that I have a problem with Kendall that I probably need to go and see a therapist about maybe. But I'm giving Roman 2 points because I actually think he's playing it quite smart. Kendall's all eggs in one basket. Roman's kind of playing the middle ground too, and I think sometimes you got to play the middle ground because, you don't offend anyone. And then I'm giving Jer Bear, I still am giving her 1 point because she survived, so you get 1 point for that.
And who lost?
Oh, biggest loser was Best Power security guard Colin. One moment he's like going to dinner with Logan and he's kind of in it. And if Kendall's the CEO, I just feel like he's a physically fit man. He doesn't need Colin as much as Logan does. And so I just don't really know what Colin's going to, if he's going to get the same level of
protecting the staircase from Carrie. That's
Carrie, taking her out the back. Like, is he going to get the same level of professional fulfillment with Kendall? I don't think so. So Best Power Colin.
Thomas, give me your rundown.
Cool. My winner was Kendall. Obviously, he made the big play. He's the CEO now, or he's going to be the interim. But also he stabbed his brother in the back, a la Logan Roy. So that's 3 points to Kendall. 2 points I gave to Tom, controversial, but I actually thought, his weird, kind of ping-ponging around the house here to serve was very much a Tom play, and at least he's keeping himself in the conversation. I think, Tom always knows how to... He's always annoying everybody, but he just stays on the, just kind of is not annoying enough to make you hate him. So I thought that was actually kind of smart. He's kind of on everyone's okay side. And then I gave Hugo a point because he has, he's taken on this job from Kendall. Kendall, for me, is the winner, so he's kind of got proximity to power, which is always important in Succession. And for me, the loser was Shiv. I guess ultimately it's a show about power, and she got stitched up by the brothers. Sure, there was lots of conversations about how it's going to be equal to the gram, but, at the end of the day, Kendall and Roman are on top, and she's in this, really weird state of flux.
And she's got to have a baby.
And she's got to have a baby, yeah. So with Tom, which is a massive loss. So for me, she was the loser.
I gave Kendall my 3 points as well. Undeniably came out of this episode on top. Marsha, I chucked a couple of points her way because she's come back from Milan, presumably with a new wardrobe, and she's seemingly kind of leading things, at least for the next little while, as Logan's most significant ex. And Roman, I gave a point to as well for sort of following his brother along and ending up in pretty senior position. I had a really tough time picking my loser between Shiv, like you did, Thomas, or Tom. I feel like Tom, we didn't really get into him in the earlier part of the conversation, but he goes up to basically every faction in contention and gets rebuffed for them. He's willing to serve the Greybeards. They shut him down. He's willing to serve Kendall. He just says, I like you, good luck. He tries to charm Shiv by reminding her of their first date and what that was all like. And she's basically like, no. She just leaves and walks away. He's basically left out on his own. Ultimately, I went with him. But the fact that him and Shiv are both at the bottom of the pile after this episode, I think leads me into my prediction for what I think could happen next. And we'll see it develop over the next few episodes, is I think both of those guys have been shafted, and maybe they'll realize, and this goes to your theory, Thomas, I think you've had since episode 1, when Meg and I very, quickly rebuked you.
Yes, I was just going to say, I predicted this Shiv and Tom reunion, and everyone laughed at me, and everyone ignored me. I thought I was like the Connor Roy of this podcast, and then look what's happening now.
Yeah, I think that maybe they'll realize that they were better together and things were working well for both of them. Whether the pregnancy plays a part in that, I'm not quite sure, but I do think that we are going to get a reunion with the two of them of some kind. Mel, talk us through your prediction.
I think we're going to see more of Kerry. I don't think you have a Kerry in the show unless you're going to use her. And the way the show has previously treated kind of the women, they don't kind of go quietly. They get their revenge, as we're seeing with Marsha now. We know that Kerry's already saying that there was a marriage deal and there's paper. She suddenly got Roman's private number. She's got something on Greg, she's probably got the sex tape floating around. She's got resentment against Tom because she didn't get the anchoring role. We know she's got ambition. And there was also that weird moment in the last episode where when Logan died, she kind of expected to be in the room and they pushed her out and she was a bit odd about it. So I think we're going to see a bit more of Kerry.
Yeah, I'm kind of into that theory because I think I predicted, shockingly, I was wrong, that we wouldn't see her again after last week. And then she was very much, she was only in a single scene, but it was a big scene. It was that was actually crushing, that scene when Marsha sends her off to the subway. That was hard to watch.
And Greg is here come the waterworks. Greg is really rubbing it in, which was really, really intense.
Greg was this echo in it the whole time in the background. This is so distasteful. He's just this little echo. It was so much.
My predictions are Kendall to go rogue, as he's already indicated, which is how the show started and so how it will probably end. But yeah, I think similar to you, Oz, I guess, I don't think it's going to be a Greybeards versus the siblings. I think it's going to be an all-out factional war. It'll be Greybeards versus Roman versus Kendall versus Shiv and Tom. It'll just be everyone kind of sniping and biting and trying to kind of bring each other down. So yeah, other than that, I really don't know what to expect. But yeah, I'm very keen to see how it plays out.
I want to ask you, do you have any predictions that people will suddenly have like Huawei phones?
Yeah, but ultimately, my biggest prediction is that the Nokia 3310 is going to make a comeback because you can't trace that shit. I have a whole drawer full of them, so if Jesse Armstrong wants to get in touch,
They're going to license fax.
Correct, just hit me up.
Well, I can't wait to check in with you on like phone watch over the next 6 episodes. Thomas, Mitchell, thank you for joining as usual. Mel, great to have you on. Wonderful to have you as part of this team. See you both next time.
Thanks for having me.
See you later.